Hello everyone, and welcome to the 47th Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can work with the responder chain in Cocoa, and I'm going to be covering what the first responder object is that we always see in the nib file, but that we try to avoid pretty much every time we do one of these tutorials. Not for any particular reason, just because I haven't explained it yet, but this is the tutorial where I will try to clear up basically the underpinnings or the ideas behind what the first responder object is and the responder chain. We won't go into amazing depth with the responder chain, but I would like to cover briefly how it works, and in the next tutorial I'll actually talk about printing, and that will be another example of using the responder chain to actually print things. So we'll get a little bit of use with it in the next tutorial, but I would like to cover really a little bit of what it is in this tutorial. So with that, basically we've learned pretty much about all the other objects for the most part in the workbench over here. And just to quickly explain, this is just a brand new Xcode project, and this one is document based, so we have our document nib and our main menu nib, and we're going to be working both of them, so just pay attention which one we're in for this tutorial. Right now I'm in obviously the main menu nib file. So we've already talked about pretty much every other object except for this first responder object. We know that these objects kind of below this divider line are basically objects that are created out of the nib. So when we've added our app controller objects and things like that, the nib file will actually create those objects for us out of the nib, and it instantiates them, etc. So these objects are kind of things that the nib file actually prepares. The objects above this line are known as proxy objects, which basically means they don't actually exist. They're just sort of there to make connections. So for example, this application is really just kind of a connection to the application we're running. It's not actually going to be created out of the nib file because it already exists, right? When we start our application, it's already running. It is the application we're running. So it's just a connection to the application. Likewise, the file's owner object is basically just going to be a later object that we will create. So for example, when we're using window controllers, for example, we were saying that the file's owner for this is going to be the window controller, and we can tell the nib file ahead of time, what the file's owner should be or what it's going to be, and then we can make connections for the nib file, and when we actually initialize the window controller, it can make those connections right into the window controller. So really, again, this is just it's not an object that's actually created out of the nib. We go ahead and create it somewhere in the code, and then we are saying, like the window controller, we say that we will initialize this window controller with some nib, and that window controller is representing our file's owner. So like I said, we don't really create this object out of the nib file, but we can set this up ahead of time to represent the object that will actually contain the information in the nib file. Now the file's owner, I guess, would be a little bit different. It's not exactly the same thing as the other ones, but it does kind of represent just connections to other things. But we do not actually create, this is not a real object that we create like the other ones. This is actually just sort of a mechanism that Cocoa has. So this first responder object, I'll just talk briefly about what it kind of represents, which is the responder chain. Now in Cocoa, there are kind of two sort of default responder chains, so to speak, in AppKit applications, and I'm just going to cover them briefly with these two images that are actually from Apple's event handling documentation. Now, depending on the application you're running, these two images here represent the responder chain. Obviously, the one on the top represents a non-document based application, right? We have this first responder object, which I'll kind of talk a little bit about. But basically, how this works is that messages will get sent along these different objects. So they'll start at the view hierarchy, they'll work their way up, so NS window controller, and this is kind of the progressive call that these messages will take. And I'll talk a bit about that in just a bit, but also this is the document-based one, which starts basically the same way, except it goes along more with how document-based applications work, which I haven't covered really that much either, but basically all document-based applications have an NS window, an NS window controller which controls that window, and then there's the NS document which we always work with, and this is what contains all the data for that NS document window, right? So every window you create with the NS doc or a document-based application, it has some sort of backing NS document class for it, and that's what we always create when we subclass it. And so that's that, and then it goes on to sort of the normal progression, and the NS document controller controls sort of all the documents. So that's the progression that messages will take when we're using a responder chain for a document-based application. And you're probably still wondering, okay, what are you talking about with the messages that we're sending? So let's take a look over at Xcode here. And I don't know if you've ever looked at this, but you may sometimes have looked at the different messages in the file menu and wondered how this print message, for example, can just be sent to something. And you might see that it is sending messages to the first responder. And you may have never really understood what that meant, but I will clarify that. So basically how this works is that this print option in the menu bar is the same as the target action that we use for different things. So if I created a window with a button, I would say send this action, right? I use target action and I say this action is going to a certain target. So if I dragged out a button, I would say I'm going to send, like button pushed to my app controller, for example, right? I set up that method in the app controller or my app delegate, wherever I want it to be. That's the message that's sent or the action. And my button is simply sending that action to the target, which is my app controller, and then, obviously it executes that message. And that's the idea of target action, is that I'm just sending some kind of message to a target. Now, what these things are doing right here is they're actually not setting a target up. The target for these objects are nil. So they're not specifically sending it to, they're not sending it to the window, they're not sending it to an app controller. Their target for these actions are nil. So if I was to set up, a column with the action and the target, the button has some kind of action, which would be button pressed. The target would be app controller, right? But these different menu bar options would be, they would have an action, which would be, in this example, print document. And I might zoom in for that just so you can see it, but their target would be nil. So they don't actually have a target to send. And you might be wondering, okay, so if it has a nil target, where does it go? Well, that's when it actually gets put into the responder chain. So if an action or some kind of thing that's pressed, like a control, if you have an action that's sent and you send that action to nil, it will actually get put into the responder chain, and then it will make this progression thing that I showed you here. So it will work its way up the responder chain. So starting at sort of the first responder object, then it goes to the view hierarchy, right? The first responder really doesn't exist. It's not really an object, but it represents where you're starting the first responder chain. So certain things can become the first responder essentially, so I'll talk a little bit about that in this tutorial. But wherever the first responder is in your application, it can usually be like a view. In this case, you can see here it represents the view, and you can say that from there, once it'll test out the print on the view, and it'll say, can you use this message? If it can't, the responder chain will just keep going up until it finds something that can actually implement this call. Okay, so basically what Xcode's going to be doing is this print is going to send the print document message, and the target's going to be nil, so it's going to get put into the responder chain. So we're going to go to whoever is the first responder. It might be a view, and so if it is, it'll start there, and basically it'll ask that view, hey, do you implement print document? If it doesn't, it'll keep going up the responder chain. So then it'll go up to the super view of that, etc. If then it'll go to the window, like I was showing you in that picture there before, and then it'll just keep going up that chain until eventually something implements it. The neat thing is, if nobody implements it, then it will actually just be grayed out. It won't actually, it'll go through the entire responder chain. Nobody will actually implement it, and it will actually be grayed out. And that's how you get grayed out menu bar items, is if it can't actually find anybody that implements that call, then you get nothing. So a very easy example of that is if I run a default application like this, right? You can see that the print option actually does exist, even though it won't work, I don't think. If I test this, yeah, it'll just crash like that. Let me just restart this. So if I run this again, if I get rid of this window right here and I go to my print, you see there is no print option, right? Basically what's happening here is it's going up the responder chain with this print document call, and it's finding that nobody implements print document. Who actually implements print document is the NSDocument class. So when we get rid of that window, which actually has that backing NSDocument class, right? It doesn't actually see any print document method implemented. So since it doesn't see that method implemented in any of the classes in the responder chain, it returns back basically that it doesn't exist, and then it'll just be grayed out. So this is actually, I don't know, to me, I think this is a pretty neat feature of Cocoa, where we can send messages along, finding if anybody actually implements them, and if nobody does, then it grays it out. So it's kind of neat. All right, so what am I going to show you with the rest of this tutorial? Well, I'm not going to really go into too much of, these different actions or anything, but I'm going to show you how you can actually implement one of your own. So if we go ahead and just add a new menu item, we'll just throw it under the print right there, and I'll just call this special action. All right, and what I want to do is we can actually create sort of fake methods, so to speak, for the first responder object. So if I go to the attributes inspector here, there's actually already one created for the default document based application. I'm not really sure why duplicate document is in there, but ignoring that, we can go ahead and hit the plus button, and we can create our own actions. So I will call this special action, put a colon at the end, and we'll hit return. And now this will add a new sort of fake action, so to speak, that we can link to in our menu item right here. So if I go now to control drag from the special action to the first responder object, you will see that if I go up to S, we should have special action right here, which is that user-defined action that I just added to the first responder. And you might be wondering, okay, what does that mean? Well, basically, it's like all these sort of first responder examples. They're not really real objects, or they're not really real actions, so to speak. They're just kind of things that I'm adding so that I can tell the nib when it's created that this menu item, I'm just saying that this menu item is going to have this action, and that it's going to be nil, essentially. That's really all you're telling it that it's going to have. Since you can't really add actions directly to buttons, you would basically, what I just did basically defines that this menu item will send this action to nil. That's basically what this defines. So the first responder object just represents sending objects to nil or to the first responder chain. So I'm just saying that this menu item has, if I just want to look at my connections, I'm saying that this action, special action, is going to be sent from this special action menu item, and it's going to be sent to the first responder, or it's going to be sent to nil. Basically what that means is it's going to be first sent to the first responder object, whoever the first responder is, and then it's going to work its way up the responder chain. So that's great. Now we have that, and what we can do is try to implement our own little example of this in action. So if I let's just say I really want to get some fancy application here, and I'm going to make a subclass of NSView here. So we'll say my view, and we'll throw that in there. And then we'll also create also an NSWindow subclass, which we haven't really done, but if you want some custom looking windows, that's what you'll want to do. We'll just call this my window, like so, and we'll throw that in there as well. All right, so let's hide some of this, hide some of that, and in my window now, let's just say that my window is going to respond to this special action, right? So if I was to run this right now, and I haven't made any links to this, I haven't actually put my window or my view in the nib file yet, so it's just going to be blank. But if you see, you'll see that special action is blanked out, right? Because nobody actually implements special action yet. So what I'm going to do is in my window, I'm going to do everyone a favor. I'm going to implement special action. So I'll say special action ID sender. And we're going to implement in the my window subclass here our special action. And all I'm going to do is just nslog something. And I don't know why that's not showing up. It's always a pain. But anyway, nslog. And let's see, this is in the window. All right. And now what I'm going to do is hop over to the document nib file. And I'm going to change the window type here to be of type my window. And I don't know why Xcode sometimes does this. I don't know if this happens for you. You can tell me in the comments if you want, but sometimes Xcode just wants to give up when I create the same files over again, and then it doesn't autofill anything. But anyway, it's a pain in the butt, but we'll work with it. So anyway, we just changed the type of this window. So when this window is instantiated, it will be my window instead of the normal NS window subclass. So let's go ahead and try this out. And by default, just to let you know, at least I'm pretty sure by default, the window will actually be the first responder for your application. So you can specify who the first responder is, but basically the current running application should be, or current running window should be your first responder. So if I go ahead up to my thumb, and you can see that now special action is not grayed out anymore because it recognizes that it exists. It went up the responder chain and said, hey, this window actually does implement this. And if I go ahead and press this, you can see that it says this is in the window. So what happened is it sent to my first responder. Pretty sure that the first responder in this case is the window, since there's nothing that could be more specific. So basically we sent that action, right? The action or the target was nil, so basically it goes up the responder chain and then it goes to this window. So that's again just kind of the ordering. To look at our image, that's the ordering of, or look at this one, the ordering of the responder chain. So that's pretty neat. I think this is pretty cool stuff. So let's try now with the window. So the view. So if I add in a custom view and throw in a custom view like this, and it doesn't matter what size it is, I don't really care. What I want to do is change this now to my view, the class, right? And what I'm going to do is actually change this so that my special action is also implemented in the my view subclass of NSView. So you would think that if this was here, right, and I'm going to change this so that you know it's in the view, this is in the view, right? That's what should be called. Now, if we looked at our picture from before, you'd think that the view should get this call first, right? Because it comes before the NS window, or the window in this case. So if I go ahead and run this, we can test this out. So what happens, you would expect that the view would get this, right? So if I go to File, Special Action, and we can see that that's not actually what happens. So what happens is that we still get the call that this is in the window. And you might be wondering, okay, why does that happen? Well, there's a very simple reason for this, is that by default, new view objects will not accept first responder status, which basically means by default, they just won't become the first responder. Now we can easily change this. Every view every NS view is a subclass of NS responder. NS responder has the method accepts first responder, which we can go into much more detail with in a later tutorial if you want. There's tons of cool things you can do with first responders. But anyway, I'll leave it with this right now. Basically, if I want this to be able to become a first responder, I can simply return yes. And so now it'll be able to become a first responder. So just to check out another cool method if you want, actually, no, I'll leave that for now. That's another tutorial altogether. But we'll leave it at this, and this should allow it to actually become a first responder, which means that the view instead of the window should get this action first. So if I go ahead and run this, and we go to File, Special Action, and as you can see now, we get that this is in the view, which is what we thought we would have got earlier, right? So anyway, that is my introduction to the responder chain, or the first responder object. The first responder object just basically represents the starting point, so to speak, for the responder chain. It's usually in your application. The first responder is kind of the active object. So in the default case, that's usually just the window because we have nothing else in the window, right? If we start adding things like text fields or text views and stuff like that, then usually those objects will become the first responder instead. And you can set this all up, but that's for another tutorial to talk about how you can deal with first responders. And the first responder always gets the keyboard events as well. So when you send keyboard events to different objects, they rely on who's actually being the responder for those objects, or those actions that are sent. So there's, I can talk a lot more about that in a later tutorial if you want. Just leave your questions or comments in the below. But really what I just want to get out of the way for this was really covering just what the first responder object is and the responder chain for both the document-based and non-document based. I didn't go over non-document based, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory how that would work as well. So anyway, if you do have any questions, leave your questions in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel, and have a good Christmas. All right, I'll see you in an upcoming Cocoa tutorial.